So I might go back to Mr. Kenny. I'm very surprised as somebody who sat across from the Minister about 2 or 3 years ago and talked about reasonable accommodation at length. I think at the time I had the very small document that is the Irish reasonable accommodation document and the very large document which is the UK reasonable accommodation document, and asked about this review and was assured that it was happening. When I say a review, I totally understand what you're saying, that things change every year, and that I presume students ask questions every year because their needs aren't being met, and then the system changes as a result. But to hear that the terms of reference are just agreed and it hasn't commenced is really surprising to me. I'm just wondering, can you set out a timeline? Because there's students here today who are struggling with the lack of reasonable accommodation.
I think, Deputy, the first thing about the RACE scheme, the reasonable accommodation for certificate examination scheme, is that it is meeting the needs for almost 1 in 4 of the Leaving Cert students this year. So there are very significant numbers of students who benefit from those accommodations. When you say it's meeting 1 in 4 students' needs, what you mean is 1 in 4 students apply for recognition under reasonable accommodation. I'm sure many of those students would say that they're not reasonably accommodated. 1 in 4 students in the Leaving Certificate this year, or almost 1 in 4 students, had a reasonable accommodation. Okay. So there's a range of reasonable accommodations that are available. Obviously, there are some that are specific to visually impaired students.
I'm just looking for a timeline of the... I have a very small amount of time. I'm just looking for a timeline of the review.
Well, as I've said to Deputy Farrell, we can come back with a detail on the timelines that are concerned, but the composition of the structures about how the review will work are currently being finalised. Okay.
Are you? I understand it's the SEC who have the main role here, but do you sit on the review body?
Well, the SEC themselves are putting in place those review mechanisms as we speak. Okay. So they've confirmed their terms of reference, and now they're looking at exactly.
Have you seen the terms of reference?
I personally haven't seen the terms of reference.
Will they be publishing them?
I would have to come back to you on that.
Okay, would the department expect to be a member of that group?
The SEC will be engaging with a broad range of stakeholders, and in that regard...
But the department isn't a stakeholder.
I understand that, Deputy. I would expect that there would be a role for the department in that respect.
Okay. I'm hugely frustrated by your answer. The department is not a stakeholder, and the SEC sits as an independent body within the department. We have talked at length in the previous session about the lack of joined-up thinking between the good work that the department is doing, introducing technology, trying to support students with mobility, trying to increase supports to schools, and that falls down when they come to exams, which is the main barrier then to their proceeding to tertiary education. It's very frustrating that the review does not seem to be as progressed as I was led to believe. But second of all, it's very, very frustrating that the department would continue to take such a hands-off approach with a group that is vulnerable in terms of education. And it's really important that they're engaged and active when it comes to the review of how we undertake exams, because there is a very real barrier here. The 10 minutes per hour reasonable accommodation. Anyone who's ever dealt with a child who has a braille sense, it takes 10 minutes to boot up the machine. It takes 10 minutes to delete something and redo it. It seems extraordinary that it's such a hands-off approach. It undermines your other work.
In relation to my own specific area of responsibility around senior cycle redevelopment, I can say to you that I have very close working relationships with the SEC. And to be fair to the SEC, there have been a number of things that they have committed to doing and delivered since the Senior Cycle Redevelopment Programme has been announced. For example, in relation to the Senior Cycle Level 1 and Level 2 learning programmes, the SEC will be certifying those programmes for the students who come through on those programmes. That's a very significant development of itself. They've also this year provided for the first time integrated reporting of results for students who were taking the Leaving Cert Applied programme but who had access to Leaving Cert established maths or to modern foreign languages. Again, that is helping students in terms of how they transition forward. So there's a lot of work that is being delivered by the SEC in relation to how they respond and how they reflect or best reflect the needs of individual students.
Okay, but they're still being taken to court by students for not receiving the correct supports.
Well, if you look at the response that was made in relation to the visually impaired pilot project, yes, there was a Workplace Relations Commission case taken, which did lead to the expansion of that scheme from Leaving Cert to include junior cycle students. So there is always a recognition by the SEC that they will adapt and they will respond and reflect different needs as they emerge.
Would you recognise that there's a top-down departmental approach from the SEC here, where they're not actually upholding the UNCRPD and the person-centred approach that we now are required to, and by the way, is actionable under the optional protocol, is now actionable in the last few weeks? They don't necessarily seem, and I have to say, I have formed the opinion that the department is giving them a free run on this. They're not actually engaging with individuals when an individual in all of their complexity and all of their very specific needs is telling them, A, this is the reasonable accommodation I will need, and B, I have no idea what you're actually going to allow me to do. It's a very top-down process, and the SEC seem to be an incredibly opaque body.
I think I just recall what I said a moment ago about the number of students who are availing of reasonable accommodations for their certificate examinations. They are very significant numbers of students who do have reasonable accommodations made to them. And it's not a one-size-fits-all scenario. There are different needs that are responded to in different ways.
But Mr. Kenny, you're talking about the number of students, which is fine and great, and hopefully we would accommodate them all. From my side of the desk, I am receiving very, very many complaints, not hundreds of students, but you know, I often hear people saying, I have no idea what reasonable accommodation I'm going to be given. Nobody will sit down with me, nobody will talk to me.
There is very detailed information that is provided each year by the SEC to schools, and the applications for reasonable accommodations are made by schools on behalf of students in their particular schools. So there is information that is made available. There is no requirement for a diagnosis in order to access those reasonable accommodations. And so where the applications are made, the SEC is responding, and the numbers of students who are availing of the scheme demonstrate how that responsiveness is being given effect.
There are students here today. Will you undertake to take some of their details and forward them to the SEC for a reasonable accommodation?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.